Welcome and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. Well, the global economy is certainly upon us, but for many of you who decide you want to become entrepreneurs, executives, and emerging leaders in the field of being able to work with this Asia's economic workforce, you might want to be known to be able to get more intercultural communication and international etiquette to find out just what people do and what they say and how they behave. Joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today is international etiquette expert and current and future leader of the Global 2,500 companies. She is the founder and president of Protocol and Etiquette Worldwide. Her work definitely takes her traveling and have taken her to more than 60 countries on 7 continents. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest, Sharon Schweitzer. Sharon, thank you for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program.
Well, thank you, Daniel. I appreciate that. I'm happy to be here.
20 years of experience providing consulting and training to more than 100,000 attorneys and corporate executives and law firms. Boy, I'll say you're probably somebody who's really in the know when it comes to things like intercultural communication and etiquette. How did you get started with something like that?
Well, a part of it began very young. I've been exploring world cultures for as long as I can remember. I'm the daughter of a military officer, so I've spent most of my life exposed to a variety of different customs. And when I started practicing law, and throughout my law practice, whether I was representing physicians, hospitals, corporations, small businesses, or entrepreneurs, I enjoyed the interaction between people, especially the cultural differences.
Now, your book is Access to Asia. Tell us how this came about. You must have seen a need there.
Yes, I did. During my workshops and training conferences, I found that clients and audience members, what they enjoyed the most were the international experiences, especially the cultural faux pas. They enjoyed the stories, they enjoyed hearing about my experiences, and they wanted to know what to do and what not to do when conducting business abroad. So they wanted to hear more about those experiences from me and from other business professionals. And that's why I wanted to write this book.
Mm-hmm. Now, you feature 10 countries in Asia, and what people might not expect is the fact that you don't just talk about Asian countries, for instance, China, Japan, Hong Kong, things like that, but you actually go further with that. Tell us about that.
Yes, we go further than just writing a book about some of the most traveled countries. We were committed to providing today's global business people with deeply researched, thoughtfully analyzed, and practical information. So to decide which countries we were going to include, we engaged a global intelligence company called Stratfor, which is short for Strategic Forecasting. And we asked them to produce a report on U.S. American business travel to Asia. We wanted to include the present and future top-ranking countries for U.S. investment and travel. Daniel, we learned that 6 countries accounted for over 70% of all U.S. business travel to Asia. Now, your listeners are probably going to be very interested to learn that these countries, China, Hong Kong, Japan, India, South Korea, and Taiwan, also represent the top trade partners with the U.S., and they are projected to account for 70% over the next decade. So we were going to include those countries. But we also wanted to include some countries that were going to emerge as increasingly important destinations for business travel over the next 20 years. So 3 of these 4 countries were Singapore, the Philippines, and Malaysia. Now, Daniel, I also had to include Myanmar, formerly known as Burma, because of my personal fascination with this country. After the bar exam back in 1989, I spent some time that summer in Hong Kong, China, and Thailand. I had tried to get into Myanmar, and I couldn't because the country was closed. But I bought this beautiful handmade Burmese tapestry in the Thai floating markets that summer close to the Burmese border. I framed that beaded tapestry in gold, and it's still hanging on the wall here in my office to this day. Well, you can imagine how thrilled I was late last summer when I was invited to attend the ASEAN, it's short for Association of Southeast Asian Nations Conference in Yangon. Myanmar. Well, I got to see for myself the tremendous potential that country offers to overseas investors drawn to the greenfield advantage there in Myanmar. So, and by the way, your listeners probably know this, but a greenfield advantage is a benefit that's gained when you're starting at the bare ground and you're building or investing in a new venture from its foundation. So, like if you have a brand new home and you're buying a lot and you're going to build, but this is in business, so it's a business opportunity that's seen as much broader and without a previous structure or walls. So that's how we made the decision to come to feature these 10 Asian countries. Was we went through that process of thorough research and actually engaging a global intelligence company.
You know, it's pretty significant, too, for our listeners, especially those who are entrepreneurs who are considering doing business overseas in places like Asia, which, you know, we hear a lot about China's growing global economy. For us to understand as Americans who we are really in position to how these people are. An interesting story that we had on the program was a gentleman who decided to go over to Europe, for instance, starting in France, to set up, you know, those retail outlet malls that we have here in this country. And they decided to set those up using their brands over there. And a really interesting experience that he had is people in France really take their time. You know, there's no micromanaging and moving things along like we tend to here in the United States. So what started out as a project that should have been maybe up and running in just maybe 8 to 9 months, it took over 3 years before the first mall actually opened. And I think it's important that as Americans that we should come to know how other countries actually do business and what the proper etiquettes are. For instance, I know that in China and Japan, as you meet with business leaders from those countries there, you don't put your hand out and shake it. That there is actually a form of disrespect, as I understand. Tell us about some of those little nuances that people should come to understand when it comes to this etiquette that we're talking about here.
Well, you raised two very important points, Daniel. And I think one of the most important things you mentioned first, and that is that we as U.S. Americans, we need to understand ourselves first and our culture first. So we did include a chapter about that in our book, Access to Asia, because we felt like we need to know where we stand first before we can appreciate where we stand in relation to other cultures, like the example you used for France with the gentleman who went over and opened the mall. So we included in Access to Asia a chapter on the United States of America to help U.S. Americans who are reading the book explore their own culture first. We highlighted some things and events that we take for granted in this country, like the fact that we prefer informality, or we have a tendency to use first names. We have the tendency to put our hand out and shake hands with people, even with people we've only just met. And neither of these is appropriate or appreciated in many Asian countries like you've just mentioned. So in certain countries, different practices are appreciated. For example, waiting to see what your host is going to do first, which gets back to your comment about international etiquette. Every country is different. There are very specific differences in each country. So, you know, there are distinctions. I can tell you that, for example, in the Philippines, you don't bow. And that surprises a lot of people. In certain countries, for example, in Malaysia, there are 3 cultures. So let me back up a minute. In the Philippines, you don't bow when you greet people. Yet, in Japan, the bows may be classified into at least 3 types based on the angle formed by the bend. So you can bow 15 degrees, 30 degrees, or 45 degrees, depending on the greeting, and depending on whether you're doing an apology, and depending on the stature and your place in the hierarchy. And then we have Malaysia, which is a Muslim country, and the greetings vary based on that country's population. depends on if you're greeting the Malays, the Chinese, the indigenous population, or the Indians. So, in that country, Daniel, you may bow, shake hands, or smile and nod.
Mm-hmm.
So, your listeners probably realize at this point that you've got to be on your AAA game if you're going to be successful doing business in different countries in Asia.
Well, here's one, too, you bring up, because I'm familiar with the Japanese way of business in some ways, and that is, for instance, in America, we respect our business leaders, the CEO of a company, for instance, or somebody who's a community organizer. But at the same time, they're the same kind of person that in this country you pretty much can stand next to at the barbecue and share a beer with. But in Japan, it's a totally different story altogether. The business leader, the CEO, is a very revered and deeply respected man. Tell us about that difference there.
Yes. This goes to, we like to call it hierarchy here in the U.S., and what they refer to it as is power distance in Asia. And there are differences in this power distance. And in Asia, and in most Asian countries, and specifically in Japan, and again in Malaysia, the power distance is much greater. They respect and they want to know where their place is in the hierarchy. They want to know, where do I fit? Where do you fit? So when we travel there, they are trying to figure out from the minute they meet you, where do you fit in the hierarchy? That's why they look for the title on your business card.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why it matters where you stand at the barbecue. That's why it matters when you enter the room, where do you sit? And you don't just sit down. So you're pointing out some very important things here. And this is a big part of international etiquette and intercultural communication. The power distance and the understanding the cultural nuances of that power distance, that's the cultural aspect. And that is something that has been happening in terms of culture from the time that they grow up. It is ingrained in society, in family. The etiquette aspect is how you handle that when you arrive in the country to begin business negotiations. How much do you appreciate your position and how you're going to handle it? How comfortable are they going to be doing business with you?
One thing, too, to be sure is that the devil is really in the details when it comes to business. I mean, again, back to Japan, because it's my most, I guess, accessible culture of the ones that you wrote about here, is business cards is another one. If you're that kind of executive or entrepreneur trying to cut costs at, for instance, the Staples on, $9.95 for 500 business cards, you dare not hand that to a Japanese executive, because chances are you won't be seeing them again. It's a very important thing, a business card there. That's a big deal for those guys.
That's correct. The business card exchange is highly revered in Japan. It has a special word, and it's called the meishi. And the business card exchange is a process. It's a protocol, and the feel of your card, the look of your card, your title on your card, and like you said, Daniel, you're so right. They go through the procedure of who in the hierarchy hands the card to who first, how it's handed, both hands, the discussion about the card. The card is not just taken and put to the side. It's never put in a wallet. It's always put on the table or in a business card case holder. It's put in a special place of honor. Business cards are extremely important in Japan, and many people think that it's not a big deal. I hear people say all the time, oh, nobody uses business cards anymore. They're passé. Well, the people who say that are not doing global business.
Exactly. It's a very big deal.
It is. And those folks must have a domestic business, because they're certainly not out there in the international market.
Well, chances are if they have that attitude, they probably don't have much of a business at all anyway, do they?
Probably not. I think you're right.
It's interesting in your book, Access to Asia, that you have an 8-question framework that helps the readers go through each of the cultures thoroughly with these 8 questions to really get a view and, to understand what it is they're beginning to, I guess, work with depending on where they're going to be. Some of these are really interesting and very thorough ways to look at things. You must have seen people over the years trip up and make some interesting mistakes. Tell us about a couple of them.
Well, yes, we have seen some mistakes. In fact, I've made some mistakes. So how about if I share one with you that I made, so we can make this really relevant. I was in, and you like Japan, so we'll go with Japan. How's that? I was in Japan where the protocol is very important, and I was in a meeting, and this meeting had been arranged because protocol is important there. So this was a cultural faux pas as well as an international etiquette faux pas. Faux pas means wrong step in French, as I'm sure a number of your listeners already know. But I was meeting with a high-powered media executive who handles print and TV, and we were visiting, and I was exhausted. I had flown in. It was a 10 p.m., 8 p.m. meeting, and at the end of the meeting, he asked me, "Do you have any more questions?" And I thought, I do. I have one last question. And intuitively, Daniel, I had that feeling I shouldn't ask this last question. However, I had just arrived. I was jet-lagged, and against my better judgment, I went ahead and asked this question: how are women in business perceived in Japan? Now, your listeners probably realize that in Japan, they are working very hard to change some things in Japan. Well, my intuition had been right. It was the wrong question, and I could tell immediately from his body language that he did not want to answer the question. At least that was my impression at that time. Without responding to my question, he requested the bill. So I apologized and retracted the question. And I said to him, "I apologize. I shouldn't have asked that question. Will you please forgive me?" And then I bowed my head and I waited quietly. Now, one thing people who make cultural faux pas need to know is that you have to respect silence. You have to wait and see if your apology is accepted. Well, very luckily I was forgiven, but Daniel, I didn't learn this for several weeks until after I had returned to the U.S. The person who formally introduced us and set up the meeting, which is a protocol required in Japan, this person explained to me that this media executive, was embarrassed not by the question, but by his lack of knowledge on how to respond.
Oh.
He didn't have the answer. Someone else within the corporation had the answer. He did not. So I had unknowingly put him in the position of losing face.
Oh, boy. And that's very important.
Yes, it is losing face. And I did not intend to do that, of course. So by including examples like this in our book, Access to Asia, we wanted to showcase to people how you can make these faux pas, and we thought it was important to keep it real in the book.
Now, you bring up, that was an interesting story for you to bring up because of the female perspective in Asia. I'm curious what that's like, for instance, the difference in India and Malaysia, because you mentioned Malaysia being mostly a Muslim country, and as most people here in America become familiar with the Muslim world, their tradition of covering women, they're not allowed to show their faces in public, things like that. What would business be like as far as the female perspective in a country like Malaysia? And then India is much different because you see where women are kind of pretty much equal, it seems like, in India. It's really kind of an interesting contrast.
Yes, it is. And the thing let's start and take them one at a time. In Malaysia, the women wear suits and blouses or dresses. Revealing clothing in Malaysia such as sleeveless blouses, skirts that are above the knee, any kind of shorts, those are not worn. Those are inappropriate, okay? The thing that is appropriate to wear for business dress and appearance, suits and business dresses and blouses or skirts or slacks, but they need to cover the décolleté, or the chest, they need to cover the arms, they need to come down below the knee and cover the leg. So the modesty is very important. The hijab, which is a Muslim head covering or a scarf, that is a representation of modesty, purity, humility, and piety. Now, it's not required for women who are not Muslim in business meetings, but just the knowledge of what that scarf represents gives you a clear indication of what is culturally acceptable and what is not. So modesty is very important. And if you want to do business as a female in Malaysia, you want to dress modestly, and you don't want to dress in a way that's going to be revealing.
Mm-hmm. So certainly the high heels are out.
Yes. Stilettos are a no-no, Daniel.
I don't even like seeing women wear them. They just don't look very comfortable, but here they're saying, forget it. It's just lights out. We're not doing it.
Well, and, you see them in private. You see them in private. I've been in a number of meetings where it's all women, and we'll have those of us Muslim women along with women who are not Muslim, and we'll all be together, and there will be some fantastic shoes going on. But let me tell you, that is in private. That is not in mixed company. Mm-hmm. And that is certainly not in a business meeting. And we will talk about shoes, and we will talk about fashion. Mm-hmm. But that is not what happens in the business world during business meetings. Mm-hmm. There's a place for fashion.
There's no doubt about that, especially when it comes to the multi-billion-dollar deal. I have to ask, because you've been doing this for quite a long time, that I'm sure that other countries, as you worked with people, became very curious about, well, why do Americans do these particular kinds of things? What are some things that stood out for you that you'd like to share with our listeners where you might say that foreigners looking at us in the way that we do business would consider them to be sort of cultural oddities?
Well, I think one of the things, and I'll include kind of a practical aspect to this, if I may, one of the things that I know the Asian cultures, especially the Japanese, the Chinese, folks in India, they look at U.S. Americans as being very individualistic. We focus on and we think of things as ourselves. We look at things in an individualistic way. And that is not how it's perceived in Asia. Mm-hmm. So they look at things differently than we do. And I think that has a big impact, a very big impact. Mm-hmm. So, we here in the U.S., it's I, me, my team, my CEO, my project. And in Asia, it's us, we. So it's our company, our team, our firm. And I think if there's anything that they struggle with, it's the fact that there seems to be so much disagreement, and they do not disagree in public. A better way to approach things in group-oriented, more consensus-building countries is to approach things from our team thought, our group's idea, our firm submitted. Show consensus and teamwork. I think that's one of the most important things people will get from our book, Access to Asia, is that a lot of times U.S. Americans don't understand is just how individualistic that we tend to be.
Mm-hmm. I think that's actually an important thing for our listeners, too, because that was always an attitude that sometimes even annoyed me about how individualized we feel we are, where it's all about what I did. You know, look at the way I tied this shoe. I did that. You know, and just the way we kind of get kind of self-centered about all of these things when you realize, but you couldn't have done that alone. You know, when you say my company, well, that's still a team that built that company. It wasn't just you, you know, and that they have in areas such as Asia the idea of the team approach, that we all do this together. And that, to me, always seemed a better way about at least communicating that anyway.
I agree with you.
Mm-hmm. Now, one interesting thing that you talk about in Access to Asia is that when it comes to doing or creating business agreements, for instance, in China, they're pretty much guidelines. They're not set in stone like we tend to think so here in the U.S.
Yes. In China, depending on the city and the region, now China is a massive country, and the business there varies, just like it varies here in the U.S., depending on the region you're talking about. So, but that is so true. One of the things you have to understand about China as a country and as a region is that things happen differently in Beijing than they do in Shanghai, and the contracts, you know, a lot of times they look at them as a guideline. They'll agree on a contract, and they'll say, okay, great, this is a guideline, this is a starting point. But then something will happen in the market, and all of a sudden they come back and they want to amend the contract. And they expect that to happen. They expect for that contract to be changed and modified. And they're surprised when it doesn't happen because they're relationship-based. They modify things because they live with those same people all the time in that same community. Mm-hmm. We in the U.S., we move frequently. We relocate. The Chinese do not do that. So they work together. Their relationships are long, long term. In those communities, those people do not move. So they must save face. So if something happens and they need to rework a contract or an agreement, they do that to save face. And we in the U.S., we don't think that's a big deal. Oh, we'll just take them to court or we'll litigate.
Right.
No, that doesn't work there, because think about that. You take someone to court and you live with them in that same community for 50 years, you can't just move away, Daniel.
Not a good idea.
They're there, and that's why there's a huge difference. They work on the contracts. They don't, it's a guideline, and they will work it out. They don't litigate. They don't want to litigate. For them, that is the highest form of dishonor.
Because keeping your word there is a very important thing as well, isn't it? The handshake still has a heck of a lot of value, unlike what it used to mean here.
Yes, it does, and that's why building relationships, inspiring trust, building relationships is so crucial. They want to know you. They want to be introduced through an intermediary they know and that they trust. And once you're introduced, then they'll consider meeting with you. Then they want to build up and get to know you, build a relationship. And then they'll reach an agreement. But that agreement is not set in stone with them. And so many times people don't understand that. They don't understand why. Well, this is a contract in the U.S. A deal's a deal. Well,
right.
It's not that way in Asia. That's not how it works.
I would think, as the listeners pick up this book, you can really begin to see that you really can take on some very interesting habits that would make you actually a better business leader and entrepreneur all the way around, wouldn't it?
That is our plan. We have included within the book a self-assessment for every chapter. It's a self-awareness profile. It's an exercise that prompts the readers to self-assess where they currently stand on any topic, any of the 8 questions, and they can compare themselves with the country culture where they plan to visit or with the individual who's coming in to visit with them. So this visual will help them discover the extent to which they might need to adapt their current mindset and their behavior to develop more robust business relationships. So, for example, one of the questions is, what's your preferred way of doing business? Are you a lone wolf? Do you want to be out there making individual autonomous decisions? Or at the other end of the scale, are you a team member? Do you like working in groups and reaching, kind of a group consensus decision? So on a scale of 1 to 6, where are you? Mm-hmm. So that's an example of one of the questions. The other question that we keep getting a lot of feedback on is question 8, Daniel. And I think some of your listeners will love this. Should a woman defer to a man as the lead if winning business in a certain culture depended on it? Never, or yes, absolutely. And that question is for men and women. We want to hear from both. We want to know, what do people think?
Such a fascinating topic. Again, the book is Access to Asia, and our guest joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program, Sharon Schweitzer. Is there a website people can find out how to get the book, the trainings, things that you provide? Because I can see how this can be an invaluable resource, even if maybe you don't go overseas. Again, as we were talking about the simple things, for instance, good business cards, and maybe you don't always handshake, and don't overkill it with the way that you dress. Just real simple things that could actually, build you as a better business person.
Oh, yes, there is. We didn't even talk about the U.S. chapter yet. SharonSchweitzer.com is my website. This book is also, right now, the #1 book in business communication as a new release on Amazon.com.
Well, very good. I know it's going to be a fascinating read when that time comes. I'm always fascinated, because I've had my experiences overseas, and you realize you can't just always do things the American way, especially if you're going to be sort of involved in the communities that you're over visiting as well.
You're right. That is so true. It's so important to understand your own culture and understand those communities before you get there.
There you go. Sharon, thank you so much for joining us here on the program today.
It was my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me to join the program, Daniel.
And I am bowing.
Well, I am bowing deeper.
There you go. Thank you again, Sharon.
Thank you. It was truly my pleasure.
You bet. We want to thank you, the listeners out there. Again, self-discovery. Find out about yourself before you take that step overseas, especially if you're considering expanding a business or a business idea you have as an entrepreneur globally. You might want to find out what's going on in the yard next door before you take that step and make those commitments. I'm Daniel Davis. We want to thank you for tuning in. Be sure to visit us at Beyond50Radio.com and sign up for our free exclusive weekly e-news updates. Thank you again for tuning in, and remember, live your day past halfway.